Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first Students Talk Back lunch panel discussion of the semester. My name is Dan Schnur, and I'm the director of the Jess Unruh Institute of Politics here at USC. And as many of you know, we host lunch programs every week with a variety of student organizations on a variety of topics. And our Student Talk Back lunch today is a format in which we co-host along with our friends from the Daily Trojan. And I am happy to be joined as a co-moderator today by Yasmeen Serhan, who is the managing editor of the DT, and she'll be joining me in the questioning of our panel. I'll introduce our panel to you in just a second, but as I think most of you know, today's conversation is one that ought to strike pretty close to home for many of you, except for Paul. But for the rest of you, and that is, we're going to talk about the cost of going to college, and we're going to talk about it both in a real-world sense, which of course affects all of you every day, but also in the political context as well. And for that conversation, we're really, really lucky to be joined by a terrific group of panelists who bring a variety of vantage points to the discussion. And as those of you know who've come and attended our programs in the past, Yasmeen and I will dominate the questioning for about the first half of the program until about 12:30 or so. And then at that point, we'll open it up to questions from all of you. So as you're listening to our panelists engage in conversation for the first 30 minutes, if there are questions that you'd be interested in hearing the panelists talk to that Yasmeen and I don't bring up, we'd ask you once we get to 12:30 and open it up simply to raise your hand, and we'll try to get in as many of your questions as possible for our panelists to answer. So let me introduce our panelists. Sitting to my immediate right is Audrey Dow, and Audrey is the Vice President of External Affairs and Operations for the Campaign for College Opportunity. And she has previously served as Program and Policy Director for Hispanis Organized for Political Equality, organization called HOPE. And for those of you who've worked with Unruh Institute in the past, you know that we've worked with the HOPE organization for many years in helping recruit and train the next generation of young Latina leaders. And Audrey certainly is one of the shining stars of that program. Audrey is also a graduate of the University of Southern California. She would not tell me whether it was 2011 or 2012, but we'll dig in a little bit later to find out. Sitting to the far right here is our friend Larry Gordon, who covers higher education issues for the Los Angeles Times. And he focuses in particular, of course, on issues relating not just to tuition, but a whole broader range of public policy challenges faced by colleges and universities here in California and across the country. He's also served as the assistant city editor and an urban affairs writer for the Times. He also worked for the Bergen County Record and the Hudson Dispatch in his native New Jersey. And he told me that he is a graduate of Georgetown University, and Larry will tell us later as well whether he was a graduate in 2011 or 2012.
1811.
Larry, you and I have both reached a stage where something like that is really a laugh line. They don't even feel any hesitation about laughing at us. So welcome to my generation. And last but certainly not least, we're very happy to have Sarah Dhanaphatana with us. And for those of you who've attended our programs in the past or are active in campus affairs, you know that she has senior positions both at the Daily Trojan and with the College Republicans. And she sits with us today not as a representative of the College Republicans, but as an analyst of these issues and how they affect all of you. So with that, Yasmeen, I'll turn it over to you to start the questioning. Have at it.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. So as Professor Schnur said, this is an issue that does hit close to home. As many of us probably realized when we opened up our USC e-bill accounts, tuition was raised by about $2,000 this year. But this obviously isn't an issue that's unique to USC. So I'm going to direct this first question to our student panelist, Sarah, and ask, how is this not just an issue that affects students? How is it a broader issue?
So the thing is that increases in tuition are driven not only by public revenue shortfalls, but they're also driven by greater institutional spending. So what we see here, even for our private institution at USC, is that the greater spending that there is in new facilities and the greater spending that there is for adding new administrators and adding new secretaries for those administrators, we're seeing that not only is it impacting the surrounding community and our taxpayers and what they're having to kind of piggyback all of not only the unpaid loans from leftover from other students, but also the students who are graduating from these colleges aren't really having the ability to afford the rest of their loans, because though they're graduating from places, prestigious colleges such as USC, they're not able to go out and make the money necessary to feed off of what they accumulated, what student debt they accumulated while at USC.
Sarah, thank you very much. And Audrey, before we ask you a follow-up question, it occurred to me when I was introducing you that I've been fortunate enough to spend a lot of time watching and learning from the good work that you and your colleagues do at the Campaign for College Opportunity. But it occurred to me, rather than describing it on your behalf, before we get further into the questioning, maybe you can take a minute and just tell the group here today what you do for the campaign and what you and your colleagues try to accomplish.
Absolutely. So the Campaign for College Opportunity is a statewide policy and advocacy organization with offices in Sacramento and Los Angeles. And our primary goal is to make sure that students in the state can access college and our public universities and our private universities, and that once they get onto a college campus, that they have a real opportunity to actually graduate and be successful. And we do all of that through policy changes, things like streamlining the transfer pathway between community colleges and the CSU, working very hard to preserve Cal Grants for students who need those policies, looking at different funding models to ensure that we are rewarding colleges not just for enrolling students, but actually for graduating students. So that's some of the work that we do. We produce a lot of research to support the policy positions that we take, things like time to degree. How long is it actually taking students to complete college? And what does that do to this term affordability? What does that do to compound the costs and debt that students are taking on, as an example?
Right. And what I would like to do, though, Audrey, before we bring Larry into the conversation, is I would like you to weigh in on something that Sarah touched on. But I think it's important for us to remember that as important a role of the cost of college obviously is to everyone here, there's a lot of people across Los Angeles and across California who either don't go to college or who no longer go to college, or the position I aspire to someday, are no longer paying off children's loans for college. And so I'm wondering if you could talk for a minute about why this is an issue that should be important to a broader swath of the electorate, as opposed to those who are directly impacted by those bills.
Absolutely. So California needs a much better educated workforce than it currently has. You know, nationally, by 2020, 60% of all jobs in the country are going to require some level of post-secondary education, be that an AA, a certificate, but we know that our economy is changing and we need more workers. In California, we're actually predicted just in 10 short years by 2025 to be 1 million baccalaureate degrees short of what our economy needs to just sustain itself. And when you factor in certificates and AAs, that number jumps to 2.3 million. So California, we are not producing the number of graduates that we need to just sustain the quality of life that you and I enjoy. More of our taxpayer dollars will be going towards social services. We see increases in crime, those kinds of things, increases in health spending when individuals don't have the opportunity to go to college, graduate, get that credential that puts them to work. So this is a real challenge for our state. It's a real challenge nationally. And I'll just say something that's, I think, really important is also in California, we have to be really mindful of our demographics here in our state. Right now, I don't know how many of you know, but in California, 1 in 2 children under the age of 18 are Latino in our state, which means that the future of California looks a lot like me. And Latino and other Latinos in this room and Latinas in this room. But adult Latinos only have an 11% rate of having baccalaureate degree. So only 11% of Latino adults have a bachelor's degree. When you think about that trend, if that persists, that means that when these young people become adults, it could be very possible that they will keep that same percentage, be only at an 11%, which would spell disaster for our state if we don't move quickly to up the baccalaureate attainment, AA attainment rate.
Audrey, thank you very much. And Larry, we do want to bring you into this conversation. We've talked about the campus. We've talked about the community. Now let's talk about the capital, the state capital here in California and elsewhere. Because it would seem, given what Sarah said and given what Audrey said, that it would be a pretty straightforward proposition for our elected leaders to understand that untenable increases in the cost of college has a real detrimental effect, not just on college students, but on the broader society. But the politics are more complicated than that, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time this year covering arguments between Janet Napolitano and Jerry Brown over whether a freeze at University of California should continue. I mean, there's been a freeze after a huge uptick during the collapse of the economy after 2008. Then there was a freeze for 3 years. Now they're actually going into the fourth and fifth year of no increase. And what's interesting is that behind all that, there's kind of a basic philosophical discussion about who benefits from relatively affordable tuition. You know, is a college education sort of a private good that helps the student and you guys to go out and make more money in life? Should the state be subsidizing that, you know, just the way they subsidize K-12 education or police forces or clean air? Or should they pull away from that and say, okay, look, only by the California master plan, only 12.5% of all high school graduates can even attend University of California, and the other 85% of the state is subsidizing those kids and those families. So is that fair? So, but of course, it tends to be either middle class or wannabe middle class or upper middle class people who go to university in the first place and are much more vocal. And nothing gets families who are not otherwise engaged in politics writing to the state assembly and then having their kid rejected at UC Santa Barbara or rejected at Santa Barbara and Berkeley, and the people somehow then engage in it, which then quickly goes into the politics of it. I think one thing in California, though, we had been so used to in previous generations with practically free college education, unlike the rest of the country, that it's almost like subconscious both in Sacramento and in many people's minds. Everybody, we were just talking before, everybody says, yeah, my dad talks about how he went to college for $200. And that, so that still, even if it's, far, even if it's 30 years ago, it's still kind of rumbling around the political consciousness of California, that this is our birthright, just like going to the beaches, we can go. And in a private institution like USC, is somewhat different, but still, USC is subsidized. Many people here, anybody here get a Cal Grant? Cal Grants are basically taxpayer, subsidies as well. So it's not completely, and plus, many other tax benefits and grants that go to University of Southern California. So, it's all in the mix. It's just debate. Should we put the money into a relatively privileged class and hope that those people will one day found the next Google, and then that person will create 100,000 jobs and, pay back the tax base 10 times more than he ever got, or 100 times million more than he ever got, or should we just let people pay what they're going to glean later on?
Audrey, as you touched on earlier, the demand for higher education simply isn't going away. It's rising in California and I'm sure nationwide. So with that in mind, what can universities do to ensure they're meeting that demand if most students are increasingly not able to meet the baseline tuition?
I think we have to rethink financial aid packages, and we have to make sure that education for students as they're coming in to let them know what's available has to happen. So, we've done a lot of work to look at, how many students would actually qualify for federal grants, federal loans, institutional aid, how many students qualify for that but leave the money on the table because they don't complete that form called FAFSA, right? So we know that statewide only about 60% of all high school graduates from the class of 2013 completed the FAFSA form. And that form is so cumbersome. It's gotten easier, but it's still, I know, very, very cumbersome. And asks a lot of questions that aren't necessarily relevant to your award at the end of the day, but it serves as a barrier for students when applying to college. And when students don't know what their estimated family contribution is, when they don't know how much a college is going to actually cost them, they stop themselves from applying because they see a big sticker shock. They see, UC costs $18,000 in tuition, but then another, $20,000 to live on campus. They see that and think, I'm not going to apply. I'm not even going to fill out that FAFSA form. So we need to do a lot more work to make sure that students are maximizing the opportunities by applying for FAFSA and actually realizing what they actually qualify for in terms of aid. The second thing is that our financial aid awards don't do a good job of reflecting the true cost of college. They don't do a really good job of taking into consideration the costs beyond tuition, the transportation, the housing, the personal expense. And for an increasing portion of our population, people are working. People have children. Students coming right out of high school into a four-year university is not the normal student, is not the traditional student anymore. Most students in California, millions of students in California are working adults who have families and have obligations. And so aid has not caught up with that. What would allow a student to go full-time or to choose a particular institution? What type of aid package would allow that? And our institutions are just a little behind on figuring that out. So I think those are some of the things we can be thinking about as to, eliminating some of the affordability challenge that students are facing.
And so, Sarah, let's bring you back into the conversation. I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about what colleges, what universities spend their money on. And I'd be interested, I think the group would be interested in hearing your thoughts about whether there are ways to rein in the cost of college by reining in the amount of money that colleges and universities spend and what they spend that money on.
Yeah, of course. So I wanted to start off and add on to what Audrey had said and something that we had discussed earlier, and that's tuition policies and their amount of transparency. So what Audrey was saying earlier is that tuition policies should allow students to be able to understand exactly what they're paying for. They should be predictable and they should be moderate and fair. And I think that's so important with what she said, because when students are coming into college, as she said, we're high schoolers, we're 18 years old, and we don't really understand the concept of expected family contribution. We may put down a number that isn't exactly representative of what our parents and what our family can afford, and so that ends up creating a problem later. But then with what Dan was saying, in terms of what universities are currently spending their money on, that has a large impact on what and how tuition costs are increasing as the years go on. So if you're a student at USC, I'm sure you're aware that when you start off, your financial aid package may start off pretty generous, but then as years go on, tuition packages will decrease, and that is offset by not only administrative costs, but also offset by the amount that is spent on facilities and maintaining and revamping facilities and creation of new facilities. So a new thing to think about, especially at USC, is where are our costs going? So this year we spent our tuition increased about $2,000. So as Yasmeen said, you open your e-bill and you see, oh, there's another $2,000 for my parents to cover. Where is that money coming from? So if you're thinking about that, you can kind of see when you walk around campus, especially with the village and the creation of like revamping Lion Center, things like that, that all comes from tuition money, and that's where your money is being spent. And that also brings up the conversation
But before you bring up another topic, can I follow up a little
Yeah,
bit on
of
that one,
course.
Sarah? Well, I'm not in admissions office here, but like most of the people who work here, we have a vested interest in smart young people deciding to go to attend the University of Southern California. Now, as I understand it, and this is not my area of expertise on campus, while some students, like you, like many of you, will make your decision based solely on the quality of the in-classroom education that you will get during your time here, some other students, particularly only able to be here on campus for a few hours or a day during their senior year in high school or coming over from their experience at a two-year, are also going to be interested in the kind of facilities that you talked about. So just to follow up, if that is the kind of thing that can help convince a really smart young man or smart young woman to attend this school or the other, is it a bad investment, or is your point rather that just needs to be more of a conscious effort for balance?
I think there needs to be more of a conscious effort for balance. I think what it goes back to is the fact that private universities are constantly fighting to lure in other students, other high school students interested in their universities. So what's happening is the increased need on behalf of the university, they believe that it's necessary to continue to revamp and make new renovations to the school to lure in students. And what's happening is it's taking away the actual focus of what's important for an undergraduate higher education, which is to receive a degree and to get the best, academic experience. So what's happening is there needs to be, I guess, a shift in focus on what universities are spending their time on and their money on, because in turn it's affecting our cost of education.
Larry, as you said before, some have framed this as an economic investment in the future, that by investing in students now, they might build the next Fortune 500 company. But as we also know, outstanding student loans and debt is also a huge issue. And even though California, thankfully, does have the lowest debt, that's still a big issue that I think is somewhere in the trillions nationwide. What impact would this debt, with students leaving universities already saddled with debt, what impact would that have on the economy looking forward?
Well, there have been some studies that people are delaying buying houses, delaying marriage, delaying having children, things like that, and perhaps even kind of twisting their career path to, they might have thought about going into more of a public service, lower income job, but instead they feel, no, I have to become a mortgage broker, or I have to become a stockbroker, or I have to become not a public service lawyer, but I have to become a Wall Street lawyer, that type of thing. On the other hand, I'll kind of kick the question back to you. I actually am of the point that, maybe newspapers are sometimes guilty of hyping the most extreme examples, and I think that it just happened the other day. I do think that for most people in California, we are lucky that the debt is fairly manageable. We were talking before that California, because the rates have been generally so low in the public, the overall average. Only half the students who graduate from, I think, UC and Cal State have any debt at all, and the debt ranges between $20,000 and $29,000, which is about the price of a new car now. So that's not really that, that crazy. I know there are certain, probably people here are probably graduating with, 60, 70,000. But I don't know. I still think that people, certain it's their own responsibility. That there are ways that if you think this through, that you don't necessarily have to be saddled with that debt. People kind of make the choice of going to, to a high-end expensive school, and they might have, maybe, I know they won't get that freshman Trojan spirit, but, they could have started out at a community college, and plenty of students transfer in, as a junior, and at the end of their life, nobody knows that they started out at, Glendale or Pasadena. They have a USC diploma, and it's just as good as anything else.
Let me ask you a question, Larry, and there may not be an answer to this, but I know there's been quite a bit of research done on the future earnings and future economic success of someone who goes to college versus someone who doesn't. Have there been similar studies done on the basis of the quality of the colleges? In other words,
there's been a lot written about that, and weirdly enough, they said overall they said no. You know, I mean, that in the big picture.
Now you tell us.
I know. Well, I mean, and I hate to say this, that, you know, I just had to do the annual U.S. News and World Report little item about, I mean, you know, the schools.
Thank you, by the way.
Yeah, the schools, you guys are tied with that Westwood school. You know, the elite colleges and universities are really a very small portion. There's 4,000 institutions of higher learning in America. And, you know, everybody's obsessed with the top 100 or even fewer, you know, and so that, yeah, I mean, obviously, I think a certain amount of people who go to Harvard and go to USC, you know, or you know, even go to, you know, the highest public, are going to meet people and make connections that they won't make, you know, at Brand X school. But I think, you know, they've done these large studies, these macro studies that show actually it doesn't matter that much, that it actually matters more about the student's own abilities. I mean, it's not to say that, you know, an upper class doesn't, you know, perpetuate itself, you know, in certain ways. That, you know, it's been proven that students who are children of college-going parents are more likely to go to college than, and what Audrey was saying before about the fear of not raising that, is that it continue generations. But apparently, some of this research is that on the big picture, it's more up to the individual and circumstances than the degree.
Audrey, you wanted to weigh in on this.
What I'll add is that I think it does matter where you start. And I think the reason is because you're much more likely to graduate from USC than if you start at a community college, right? If you go to a community college, 6 years later, you only have a 30% chance of ever completing. If you chose to go to Cal State LA instead of USC, you would have only had about a 56% chance of graduating after 4 years, compared to probably 80 or 90% chance of graduating. So the end goal might be that, you know, these degrees are somewhat comparable, but you're more likely to graduate from a University of California, from a private nonprofit like USC, like Stanford, like the Claremont colleges. You're much more likely to be successful than you would at a community college or at a CSU system. So that choice that you're making at the beginning, I think, is really determines a lot of what your fate will be. Will you have that bachelor's degree at the end of 4 years or 6 years increasingly? Will you have that piece of paper?
So just to clarify here and to square that circle, and then we really do want to go to all of your guys' questions in just a minute. But Larry, let me come back to you on this. What I think I hear the two of you saying originally sounded contradictory, but as I thought about it, it isn't. What I think I hear you saying is, if you graduate from a less exalted university, your chances of success are pretty similar as if you go to, you know, somewhere more high profile, but the likelihood of completing your degree at that less exalted alternative is smaller. Is that what I?
Well, I just would just maybe take one point with what Audrey said. Community colleges, I don't think is a perfect example, because it's basically open admission. And I've interviewed many kids just sort of go there rather than, you know, getting a job down the street at the Walmart. You know what I mean? They mom and dad just say, you know, get your butt, do something. And then they're not the students who are motivated enough to at least, you know, fill out the Common App and come to USC or go to UCLA. So there's a certain amount of that percentage that it's just kids who are not. I mean, I know many students of, you know, your age who just decided, I'm going to make this, you know, work. And even if it's difficult to get classes, they're motivated enough to push their way through and transfer it. Admittedly, it's not easy all the time, but I mean, I think a lot of the, you know, it's definitely doable.
Well, and that's where the challenges with data get fairly tricky, because it's awfully tough quantitatively to differentiate between an 18-year-old who's going to community college because he or she doesn't know what else to do, and one who says, I am going to go to this 2-year, and I'm going to save my money, and I'm going to get good grades so I can transfer to USC or UCLA or Berkeley or something like that. Statistically, I'm not sure how to do that differentiation at the beginning of a first term.
You know, we've looked at this question pretty, you know, in depth, and the way we have to calculate it is we look at, you know, are students attempting college level English? Are students attempting college level math? Are they enrolled in more than 20 units or more than 12 units in their first semester? That usually indicates that a student is trying to complete, whether that's an AA or a transfer or a certificate. Those are some of the indicators that we know a student isn't there taking one class or two class. And when we look at that, when we look at students who attempt either college level English or math, and they attempt at least 12 units in that first semester, 27% completion rate after 6 years.
I just want to raise a completely different point. We talked about this before, just as for discussion. On the other hand, talking about affluent schools, I just wanted to raise the point, and maybe this could, you know, start some more discussion as well. The idea of, you know, USC is right now in the middle of a $6 billion with a B fundraising campaign. You know, Harvard has a endowment of $40 billion. You know, what about the idea of just charging no tuition at relatively
I suspect we'd have a pretty strong lean in
yeah,
direction if we were to
but I mean, and you know, it always. I mean, I actually don't get, you know, what the Ivy Leagues do with all that money. I mean, even if they're only making, you know, nowadays, you know, 2%, but I doubt that. You know, even if they're making 10% on the endowment, that's more than enough to have every single undergraduate times 100 go for free.
We have an in with the new president of Cornell. We'll ask her and see what she has to say about it. Let's do this. As I mentioned at the beginning, and for those of you who haven't come to these lunches in the past, for the first half, Yasmeen and I really do like to ask questions because, well, we like to ask questions. But basically to set the groundwork for a broader conversation. And what we'd like to do at this point now is open that conversation and to see if there are any of you who have questions that you'd like to ask either to any specific member of our panel or more generally for them to take on. Two quick reminders. Number one, when you raise your hand and we call on you, we'd ask that before you ask your question, tell us who you are so we know who's joining in the conversation. And then second, particularly if you're going to ask a question of a panelist with whom you might disagree on something that came up, we'd ask you to remember that that person deserves the same kind of respect and regard as you would if you were on the panel. And so we'd ask that you frame the question with just as much respect as you'd hope they would to you if they were challenging you on something with which you disagreed. Got that, Nick? Run into a problem with that in the past, but we're gonna try good manners this year. I'm not holding my breath. But let's start here. And let me ask the question this way, because Katrina, I think there's several good questions in there, but I'll tell you the one that leapt out at me is, you know, Larry, you have the opportunity to interview the men and women, you know, who make these decisions, who run these universities, not just the presidents, but the people around them. What do they say when a question like this arises?
I mean, often, you know, they often say, well, that's the sticker price, you know, that actually for most students, they are not paying that, you know, and that in fact, there's this thing, you know, they call it discounting, you know, other people call it financial aid. It's a very complicated system, and actually there's a lot of sort of like gaming of, can we entice this student to come if we, you know, give them this much more. So that, I mean, I think it's more like what is the net and what is the average that people actually pay. You know, even Harvard, you know, that is the sticker price, but anybody who makes 100,000 and under basically goes for free to Harvard. It's, you know, the next level up. You know, but what they say and what they don't say, but what is true is that, you know, colleges are obsessed with competition, and you know, they feel that they have to spend on higher academic salaries to attract people. USC, we were saying before, has just been poaching very famous scientists from the UC system, you know, and those people definitely are coming in at...
I'm sorry, the word poaching, we prefer the term recruiting in a high-minded and perfectly ethical manner. Thank you.
Liberating. As they said, I actually have heard that. There are people, they say, oh yeah, I mean, it's they almost is like a PR playbook that the UC system is so bound up with regulations. Come to free market USC and you will thrive. So, but seriously, you know, there are, you know, so many costs of this. I don't know, you know, whether, I don't think hoarding is the right word. You know, is that what they spend the money on and the levels of the salaries. If you went back 30 years ago, you know, an assistant professor, you know, it made significantly less, you know, than they do now, and the dorms, you know, did not have Harry Potter-looking cafeterias as is going to be in the Village over here. You know, it was just cinder block. I mean, you know, I went to some fundraising events for USC around the country, and they showed the slides of the new Village. You know, and everybody oohed and awed over it and did make jokes about Harry Potter, and but you know, it does cost, and you know, donors are giving it. So I mean, I think part of it is this is kind of in this upper tier is this competition, and I mean, in a sense that, you know, it doesn't seem to be any lack of. There doesn't seem any holes in the freshman class at USC, that even with people who are not getting financial aid or maybe insufficient financial aid, the class is still full, and I don't know, the demand is still there, and I don't know if the demand collapse, but yeah, I mean, it is partly demand and partly really increased costs, and I think that. People would, if they all sort of said at the same time, okay, we're going to stop this mania for improved facilities, for higher salaries, you know, for this and that, that some of it would stop growing.
Yes, you had your hand up. Okay, and you are?
So I think the first thing to think about is the fact that you guys and all the students here have a big role on campus in terms of speaking to President Nikias and speaking out to administrators, especially with undergraduate student government, becoming a delegate or working with them to kind of be a liaison between students and expressing your concern for the amount of facilities and the revamping and renovations of all these crazy things on campus. And I think that it's important to actually go out and express your concern, because it's going to continue to happen if administrators just think that it's making us happy, when in reality, I mean, I guess it is, because it's nice to come on campus and see all these new renovations, but at the same time, what it's doing to our tuition costs is extremely detrimental. But I also wanted to bring up, going off of what Larry had said earlier, another reason that we're seeing such great increase in higher or in tuition costs in general is the fact that loans are being more readily distributed to students. And I think that's a topic we haven't really explored too much this discussion, but that I'd like to talk about in the future, because I think especially with the New York Federal Reserve Board, they actually brought up a study recently talking about the fact that the increase of loans and the available loans distributed to students have actually created the ability for private institutions to raise their college tuition prices. So thinking about the interplay between loans, subsidies, and what that's actually doing to our taxpayers, and in return how it's affecting students is important to think about.
Yes, and I should warn the panelists that this young man is a blogger, so be careful. It's good that you have your priorities straight. Go on.
I mean, there have been some there's been some investigations actually, and federal investigations into whether some universities should keep their not-for-profit status. You know that USC doesn't pay taxes, but should all the elite colleges be actually considered just as a profit-making institutions? And if they're not as a nonprofit, doing their charitable work that they should be doing, should they lose that status? But they never went anywhere. I mean, it's just like the lobby and the power of the institutional sector is just too gigantic. And there have been some attempts in the Obama administration to almost shame universities with they were about to do this rating system of that put much more effort on the attention to the rate of tuition and tuition increases and things like that, and even that's been kind of beaten back away by lobbying. So I mean, there are things. There's never going to be rent control for tuition within within the private sector. But I don't know, the alumni network and the lobbying of the private sector seems to be pretty powerful.
I agree with Larry that I don't think much is being done. I think, the state has a little bit of power in California with its financial aid dollars. So I think for some bad actors that, in terms of like our private for-profit colleges, I know that the state is tying, Cal grants are contingent upon the loan default rate of that institution's graduates. And I think that's one way at getting at if you have really high tuitions, your students can't be defaulting on those loans once they graduate, which means that they have to be gainfully employed once they leave, that they're getting some value for the time they've spent in that college. But I haven't seen much more than that, other than obviously the state can work to cap UC tuition.
Other questions? All the way in back.
Well, I mean, it's not my place to make a judgment about it, but I mean, just reporting it, it's amazingly interesting. That was a great story, and there's a lot of debate within the University of California, for example, whether they should have an in-house manager of the funds, their endowments, or an outside manager. But no matter what, I mean, the point is, no matter what they spend on the management, it's what they do with the rest of the money. To me, that's the most interesting thing. Should they just open up the doors and have it free? In New York City, have anyone heard of Cooper Union? There's this famous architecture and design college that for many years, for generations, has been there since the 1800s. It's totally free. It's one of the most prestigious architecture and design schools in the country. And it always was completely free. You got in, free ride. And just last year, they started to put tuition in. And it's caused. They said they couldn't keep that up anymore. But it's caused a huge division, civil war within the university. So I don't know. I also just think that maybe being much more transparent about of colleges, letting people know exactly what are the levels. I hear too many times parents confused and then gaming the system as well. I mean, you know, it's everybody coming in. I didn't get enough. What should I do in the FAFSA? It's, you know, as Audrey was saying, like, should we hide this? You know, it's, you know, not tell them about grandma's apartment, you know, behind the house, or, you know, and you know, all sorts of other complications. And that I just think it's way too mysterious to people.
My opinion is that it forces taxpayers.
Audrey, you had spoken near the beginning of the program about what you felt were benefits for others in society who were not directly impacted by the cost of tuition and presumably student debt. Maybe you can talk to Ryan's question?
Sure. So, I mean, we've done a study on the return on investment for every dollar that California invests in public higher education and in the Cal Grant financial aid. And so for every dollar the state invests, it yields $4.50 in return. That's in an increased tax base because we know when we invest in higher ed, more students go to college and they graduate and they have higher earnings than if they didn't go to college. We have less dependence on social services like healthcare, like our CalWorks program. We have lower rates of incarceration because college graduates aren't dependent on these systems and they're less likely to go into an incarcerated state. And so we know that there are big returns for the state. And so I think it kind of comes to a fundamental question on whether or not you view education as a public good. But I think we have to think about, you know, if our investment in K-12 exists, and we're going to continue to believe that K-12 is a fundamental right for our students, and we need it for civic engagement and for an educated citizenry, and we know that K-12 isn't going to cut it anymore in the economy, it would be natural to flow that we would want to cover a portion, support students who can't afford it for higher ed. I think some of the question is, should we be supporting students whose families can already afford it?
And Ryan, I'll apologize because we're running a little bit short on time and I want to get in just one more question. But I know that at least some of the panelists will be more than happy to continue the conversation with you after we finish. It looks like it. Alec?
I mean, I think it's great. I mean, you know, there's no reason that Stanford should charge anybody anything. University of California, you know, they have this freeze that will, you know, go into its fifth year. So the tuition there is now $12,200. In Cal State, I think it's $6,500. Is that right, Audrey? And you know, whether that could be maintained, you know, in the future is you know, the open question. The University of California and Cal State and community colleges really suffered 7 years ago. I mean, they are just kind of like catching up right now in their state funding. They were just massacred in the state budgets. And interesting enough, you know, other areas like prisons, and someone said before, you know, prisons and healthcare took a lot of the money. So, you know, whether it should be frozen, or maybe more important, as Audrey had mentioned, I think that to at least be moderate and predictable. I mean, I think that's probably what people want. I think people can stomach a certain predictable, small 5% rise, you know, with some foreknowledge, but not just opening up your email and, as somebody said before, and getting a $2,000 hike, you know, with no warning. I mean, I don't think that's fair. I don't think that that's productive for families and for kids, and I think it's kind of unnerving and discouraging for families. But if you know, if USC had set a pattern and said, okay, you know, you can expect this, and not, you know, slam you on the head with a surprise, I think it would be better.
By my count, Yasmeen and I have another 40 or 50 follow-up questions, and we're probably not going to have time to get to those today. So what we're going to do instead is we've got a few announcements. Before we thank our panelists, we have a few announcements we'd like to make. But Larry, I believe you have an announcement you'd like to make.
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering, I cover a lot of different issues of higher education. I always want to connect with students and, you know, regular students, student activists, all different types, so on many different issues. So if anybody would be nice enough to, if you're willing at some point to give me your name and phone number and email, and at some point I might call you up and you know, ask you about some other topics. So if anyone wants to sign up, I'd appreciate it. And
Well, anybody who'd be willing to help Larry and his colleagues at the Times cover higher education issues, I would be very, very grateful for your help. So once we break here, if you are willing to put on your name and email address, that you'd be making a terrific contribution.
And if you want to take, I'll put a couple of my cards here. If you don't feel comfortable putting your name, you can always call me.
Great. A couple of quick announcements before we wind up. I mentioned at the beginning of today's program that we do weekly lunch panels like this one, starting at 11:30 and ending at 1 o'clock. Well, next week is an exception to that. Instead of holding a lunch panel like we will every Wednesday for the rest of the semester, next Wednesday night is the next Republican presidential debate. And so we'll be gathering in the new Annenberg building to watch that debate starting at 5 o'clock p.m. And after the debate ends at 6:30, we'll be holding a panel discussion like this one with a couple of political experts from off campus and a couple of student political experts as well. So hopefully you'll meet us in Annenberg next Wednesday evening instead of here at Wednesday lunch for that conversation. And for those of you who wonder why we're doing a program for the Republican presidential debate, I will let you know that in early October we're doing one for the first Democratic presidential debate as well, and we'll give you more information on that as we get closer. The following week, Tuesday, not Wednesday, Tuesday, September 22nd is National Voter Registration Day, and we'll be registering USC students and others on Hahn Plaza all day long, so please come out and join us for that, and encourage your friends to do so as well if they have not registered. We certainly do, and we'll be able to, Alyssa will be happy to help you afterwards. And then finally, as most of you know, this Friday is the drop ad deadline for classes. But what that means also at the Unruh Institute is Friday's the deadline for taking on an internship for the semester. And as many of you know, in addition to our traditional internship, where we help you get placed in the office of a candidate or an elected official or an advocacy organization, this semester we've begun a civic engagement internship in which a small number of USC students are going to be going into area high schools and middle schools in the community surrounding the campus to talk with these students about the importance of voting and political participation. And that's something you can get academic credit for as well, just like a traditional internship. And you're more than welcome to come by our offices in VKC 263 if any of these things sound interesting to you. Finally, help expand our social media pages. You can friend us on Unruh Politics or like our page, Jesse M. Unruh Institute of Politics. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Our goal is to get 700. It's ambitious. 700 likes and followers on each media page. So if each one of you tells 35 people, we'll get there without any problem whatsoever. Anyway, so next Wednesday we will not have a lunch, but hopefully we will see you again at Annenberg in the evening for the Republican debate. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking Larry Gordon, Sarah Dhanaphatana, and Audrey Dow for their terrific conversation. Thanks to our colleagues at the College Republicans and the College Democrats and the Daily Trojan for co-sponsoring today's event, especially my co-moderator, Yasmeen Serhan. Thanks to the team at the Unruh Institute. Thanks to Kat Shea. Thanks to Tanya Mercado. Thanks especially to Alyssa Rangel and Ali Bissonette for the terrific work they do in putting together these programs for us every week. Guys, thank you very, very much. And most importantly, thanks to all of you. And we'll look forward to seeing you next Wednesday evening and Wednesdays after that for further lunch discussions. Thanks so much for coming.